Sean O'Malley just became the MMA bantamweight champion by hitting Aljamain Sterling with a devastating right-hand counter.
Sterling on it.
However, O'Malley's win may have gone to the champ's head, as he's now calling out the one and only Gervonta "Tank" Davis. He won't become a star, he is a star. First off, let's begin with some background. O'Malley met with Sterling at UFC 292 to fight for the bantamweight belt. The fight was intense and ended with a TKO in the second round. Sterling squared up to O'Malley and fired off several shots, only for O'Malley to counter the Jamaican MMA fighter with his right hand, which landed squarely on Sterling's jaw. The ex-champ fell down, giving O'Malley the belt. Dana White commented after the fight that O'Malley isn't going to become a star. Instead, he already is one, and it's easy to see why. The beef with Tank. So, how does O'Malley go from becoming the UFC bantamweight champ to fighting one of the best pound-for-pound lightweight boxers currently in the game? In this post-fight interview, O'Malley showed some interest in facing off against the 29-0 boxer. According to O'Malley, he's looking for big fights, and he knows a fight with Davis would be huge.
Gervonta, you could consider him like almost a star, and that's what gets me excited. Me versus Gervonta would be massive.
Although he hasn't responded to O'Malley yet, a few people have chimed in about the potential fight. On the boxing side of things, Ryan Garcia, who actually got knocked out by Tank Davis in a prior fight, said O'Malley needs to stick to MMA and that he would get pummeled by the undefeated boxer. O'Malley clapped back by replying, "Like you did or different?" Tank versus O'Malley. Now that everyone's caught up, let's discuss the elephant in the room. If Gervonta Davis and Sean O'Malley were to have a hypothetical boxing match, who would win? Boxers hit harder than MMA fighters. Going into the fight, Davis already has a huge advantage over O'Malley. He hits harder. O'Malley is an MMA fighter, and while striking is a part of the MMA, there is also more that MMA fighters train in, namely grappling and groundwork. Since boxers train only striking, their punches are better trained via setups, openings, timing, feints, and power derived from footwork via pivots and angles. Thus, as a result, strikes can be shown to be more damaging than the average MMA fighter. That's one point to Davis. It's a classic jack-of-all-trades, master of none scenario. Davis has faced bigger opponents. The old saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And although this is true to an extent, size plays a role in fights. Davis stands at 5 feet 5 inches, 1.65 meters, and has a 67.5-inch, 171 centimeter reach. O'Malley, meanwhile, stands at 5 foot 11, 1.8 meters, and has a reach of 72 inches, 183 centimeters. Although O'Malley has the size advantage, this means nothing for him. Davis has routinely faced opponents bigger than himself and has no issues with it. This is another point for the Tank. Davis has had far more fights. Another benefit Gervonta Davis has over Sean O'Malley is their difference in experience. Sean O'Malley has been a professional fighter since 2015, and in that time has had 19 total fights. Certainly no small number, yet it's dwarfed by the amount of fights that Gervonta Davis has had. Davis hasn't had 19 fights. He's had a whopping total of 29 different fights. Plus, to boot, Gervonta Davis has never been defeated. Experience is yet another point that favors Davis over O'Malley. We've seen this before. If these points don't convince you that Davis would beat O'Malley, then would a history lesson suffice? We've seen MMA fighters face boxers before in boxing matches and, surprise, surprise, the boxers win. Look no further than the classic McGregor versus Mayweather fight back in 2017. McGregor ultimately lost the fight against Mayweather by way of a TKO. Interestingly, O'Malley has actually referenced this fight when he talks about facing Davis. O'Malley claims that he doesn't want to repeat the Mayweather and McGregor fight. Tank's raw power. Gervonta Davis has remained undefeated since he first began boxing back in 2013. In his numerous fights, he has posed two primary problems to his opponents. The first major problem is Tank's raw power. Despite being in a lighter weight class, Davis has serious punching power, unlike anything that O'Malley has faced. To be fair though, O'Malley is also known for his huge punching power. Insane speed. This point goes hand in hand with the last point. Not only does Gervonta Davis have some serious firepower in both of his hands, but he can also unleash those bombshells in rapid succession. Davis has knocked men out with both hands and with various shots, instead of being limited to singular punches. O'Malley, meanwhile, has speed, but would likely be slower than Davis in the context of a boxing match. Ultimately, that's all hypotheticals though. Let's answer another question. If this fight were going to happen, how would it happen? O'Malley's journey to Davis. Sean O'Malley has acknowledged that his dream fight with Gervonta Davis isn't in the near future. Sugar has said that to fight against Tank, he'll have to probably win another belt or fight before Dana White would be willing to back his dream matchup. Despite this, however, Sean O'Malley is super confident that the fight will happen. He compares it to when he said that he would be champ in the past. Everyone doubted him and said it would never become a reality, only for O'Malley to ultimately prove everyone wrong. Perhaps history could repeat itself and O'Malley could face off against Tank in the ring. Who's next? Who is Sugar going to fight next after UFC 292? A few people are up, including Sterling himself. Sterling said before UFC 292 that he planned on moving up to the featherweight class and fighting within that class before changing his mind post-loss. In the post-fight interview, Sterling was insistent that he face off against Sugar immediately, and he certainly had a point. Funkmaster had unified the bantamweight belt by facing off against several contenders, including TJ Dillashaw, Henry Cejudo, and Peter Yan. The fighter's work towards earning, defending, and unifying the belt has made him a fan favorite of who Sugar will face next. Sterling isn't, however, the only contender. Another person who might be fighting Sugar is none other than Marlon Vera. The infamous leg. Marlon Vera is the only person who has defeated Sean O'Malley throughout the champ's entire MMA career. Their infamous fight happened back in 2020 and lasted a single round. O'Malley had a damaged leg and foot during the fight that Vera took full advantage of. As the first round was nearly coming to a close, O'Malley's ankle actually buckled and he fell down. Vera then hopped on top of O'Malley and began to pummel him with elbows. The ref ultimately stepped in and declared the win to Vera. That's to say, the two have history, and O'Malley is certainly interested in avenging that history. Despite Sugar's interest in Vera, he's also acknowledged that this fight isn't the most likely next contender. Sterling's Avenger. One of the most likely candidates for O'Malley's first title defense has a bit of poetic justice. Merab Dvalishvili is a partner of Sterling and is one of the highest fighters in the current bantamweight pecking order. Dvalishvili is currently recovering from surgery but should be healed up in the fall, one of the more likely times for O'Malley's next fight. Not only does the timing match up, but Dvalishvili is also another huge driver for the UFC. The Sandman. Another very likely candidate for O'Malley's first title defense is Corey Sandhagen. To add a bit of spice to this matchup, they also have a bit of beef. For context, Sandhagen was scheduled to fight against a fighter named Umar Nurmagomedov. The Ukrainian fighter was undefeated. O'Malley commented on the fight and said it wasn't a smart decision for Sandhagen, even though O'Malley gave respect to Sandhagen for being willing to fight the up-and-comer. Sandhagen, however, didn't take the compliment. Quite the opposite, in fact. The Sandman claimed that O'Malley's style of thinking was weak because it was based purely on business. Sandhagen said that O'Malley's style of thinking is to fight the weakest guy for the most money instead of being willing to face anybody. Sandhagen believes that if you're going to be a world champ, then you need to act like it. And the Sandman certainly doesn't seem to think that O'Malley is acting like it. Perhaps they can settle their differences in O'Malley's next fight.